Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Dr. Leila Lewis. I'm a board-certified obstetrician and gynecologist and the medical director of Adventist World Radio and the host of Level Up. It is a pleasure to have you join us again this evening. Tonight's presentation is going to be very exciting. But before we start that, we wanted to talk a little bit about how we got here. How did we get to level up the program? For those of you who haven't yet had a chance to watch, we ask you to go back to awr.org/health and access the archived videos, the medical symposiums over 6 weeks ago. We began this process of comparing the 1918 pandemic to the current COVID-19 crisis, and we were surprised to find novel lessons, things that were utilized by organizations, specifically the Seventh-day Adventist institutions, or sometimes referred to as sanitariums, some of those things that they were using therapy to unusual things of nutritional principles that we're going to be talking a little bit more about tonight. But one of the most fascinating things that was utilized was this combination, holistic health, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual healing. In fact, from the origination of the time of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, about 160 years ago, the church and its healthcare entities have believed that God would have us to combine all. And with that, I want to introduce my good friend, Dr. Dwayne McKee. Dr. Dwayne McKee is the president of Adventist World Radio, and he's going to invite God's presence as we enlist spiritual healing on our meeting tonight. Thank you, Dr. McKee.
And thank you, Dr. Leila. It's great to be here. I'm so excited about tonight's topic. Every Sunday night as we come together, I'm thrilled to learn more. I just pray that the Lord will bless each one of us. We thank all of our doctors for their participation. Shall we pray? Father in heaven, we're excited, and we thank and welcome all those who are online. We pray that you will bless each one. Help us to understand how to live happier, healthier lives. We thank you for your blessings now in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Dr. McKee. You know, we've been hearing a lot about prevention. We studied it for 6 weeks through the medical symposium. We studied it last week. But tonight, we're going to take it one level up, if you will. We're going to be looking at prevention related to self-attack. What is self-attack? Well, for many of us, whether we have children or grandchildren, or we're teachers, or we just know of children in our community, there's been a lot of news lately about the effect that COVID-19 is having on the pediatric population. We thought that they were somewhat protected, but over the last 3 weeks, we've seen an increase in something called Multisystem Inflammatory Syndrome, or previously Kawasaki-Like Syndrome, a sequelae, if you will, of this COVID situation in children. Why is that happening? Well, we're going to delve into that topic, self-attack or autoimmune, and how you and I can fight back. Before we do that, before we delve into tonight's topic, I want to invite my good friend and mentor, again, Pastor Mark Finley. Pastor Mark Finley is a well-written, amazing international speaker. He's also the special assistant to the president of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Pastor Mark, last week we looked at prevention of COVID-19, specifically from a historical perspective. What did we decide or determine based on history, even in some cases before germ theory even existed?
Well, Dr. Leila, last week we were talking about quarantine. And we looked back at the biblical book of Leviticus, and there in Leviticus, the Bible talks about leprosy and quarantining or isolating lepers from the community. Now, it's very interesting. For some diseases in the Old Testament period, the individual was isolated or quarantined, rather, for 7 days. Other times they were quarantined for much longer periods of time. It's interesting to look at the reason for that. Largely, the reason was to protect the larger community. So quarantine is an act of self-love, loving others as you love yourself, to protect them from the rapid spread of disease. When you look down through history, one of the major plagues that came in the 1st century was the Antonio plague, 165. And Rodney Stark is a historian. He looks back at that period of the Antonio Plague where that infected the Roman Empire. Roman soldiers actually brought it back from the lands they conquered. And when Rodney Stark looks at that, he says that the Christians had only 50% the death rate of the general Roman population. There are two reasons for that. One is the quarantine, but there is another, and that was their attitude of self-sacrificial service. They were not consumed with worry or fear. They actually ministered to the sick, while at the same time their larger community was quarantined. When you come down to quarantine in the last, say, 500, a little longer than that now, probably the last 800 to 900 years, you go to the 14th century, and that's when the bubonic plague spread through Europe, killing, some believe, close to 30–40% of the population in some areas. Boats had come back to Venice from Asia. These boats were carrying grain. The fleas attached themselves to rats. The bubonic plague spread rapidly. But the Venetians had this sense of the biblical concept of quarantine. They actually kept boats in the harbor and the sailors on those boats for 40 days and noticed that they were being protected from the bubonic plague. You can come up to 100 years later, where the bubonic plague swept through Europe in a second phase, and our Jewish friends in Jewish communities had much less spread of the virus, largely because, again, of quarantine. You go to 1918, the Spanish flu in the United States. The Spanish flu killed about 50 million people around the world. And again, you have pockets where they were quarantined. This is particularly true in Seventh-day Adventist sanitariums that had much less death rate than the general population. And when you look at history from the Old Testament days of Leviticus down to our generation, quarantine has been that act of special protection for the larger community. Wow. And it is a biblical principle.
That is fascinating, Pastor Mark. You know, I've been thinking about that all week, and I associated that with even what Dr. Steve talked about to us last week, as how Korea approached this as a kind of a community, and we look at it biblically, giving to our neighbors as we would want to be done to ourselves. Thank you, Pastor Mark. That was a beautiful synopsis. You know, as we look at tonight's topic, specifically the topic of prevention and Kawasaki-Like Syndrome, a multisystem inflammatory syndrome of children, we want to understand this more. And I am very excited to introduce, I dare say, my best friend, Dr. Ugonna Woods. Dr. Woods is an amazing pediatrician. She's the assistant director of one of the practices here in Phoenix, Arizona. And she's also the director of medical services of Your Best Pathway to Health, a community organization that provides free medical, dental, eye care, and surgical services to the community at large. If you're interested in knowing more about Pathway to Health and Dr. Woods Association, you can go to pathwaytohealth.org and learn more. Dr. Woods, thank you so much for joining us. You know, thank you, Dr. Woods. I have a question for you. As a pediatrician, we're seeing this in the news. As a mother of 4 children, I have a personal concern, but also a concern for the community around us. Can you tell us a little bit about this sequelae to this COVID-19 situation within our children, our pediatric population?
Right. Thank you so much for having me here, Dr. Lewis. It's a pleasure to be here. So let's start out with what is multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. So basically, it's a disorder that causes inflammation in different organs of the body, including the heart, the lung, the kidney, the brain, the gastrointestinal tract, and skin or eyes. Its symptoms include fever, abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, neck pain, red swollen eyes, tiredness, headache, and rash. So it has a wide variety of symptoms. It can also lead to shock and heart failure as it progresses. It presents 2 to 6 weeks after possible COVID exposure or COVID infection. And this is why originally we thought children were immune or not getting this COVID-19. They had very little symptoms, but what we're discovering a month or 2 months after they've been exposed to COVID or gotten infected with it, they are having this infection, this syndrome. It's linked to Kawasaki disease, or we call it Kawasaki-like disease. And that's because Kawasaki disease causes fevers, it causes some of the same skin findings, it causes some of the same findings in the heart that this multisystem inflammatory syndrome is causing as well. So I know when we first saw, we've had 2 patients in our clinic. When we first saw them, we assumed that it was Kawasaki or Kawasaki-like illness and sent them to the hospital here in town for them to get treated. So as parents and as providers, what can we do to try to prevent this, or how to treat it? So you can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so the disease, it requires hospitalization and treatment. Just like when adults get COVID-19, they need supportive care, oxygen, things like that. It's the same with children. When they get this inflammatory disorder, they need supportive care, oxygen, fluids. They also need steroids, IVIG, which is immunoglobulin that they can give them. It causes inflammation throughout the body of these children. And so after they have left the hospital and they've gone home, they need continued monitoring of their heart to make sure that their blood vessels are okay and that there's no inflammation and problems in their heart vessels. One thing I do want to mention is that this multisystem inflammatory syndrome is rarely fatal. There's been very few pediatric deaths from it. So that is an encouraging thing, but it can be very scary when these children get sick, and a lot of times they wind up in the hospital later because a lot of parents are trying to stay home and keep their children safe at home. And so when they present to the hospital or they present to the pediatric office, they're very sick. As far as the etiology, it's somewhat unknown. It's linked to COVID-19, but when we're testing these children to see if they are positive for COVID-19, half of them were actually negative. And then they did further testing for the COVID-19 antibodies, and that's to see if you've had an infection in the past with COVID-19. And some of them were positive, but again, some of them were negative. So we're not sure exactly where this inflammatory syndrome is coming from, but the important thing is to be able to recognize it. Some things we know about it is that it affects minority children at a greater rate. We're not sure why, but this is similar to the COVID-19 in adults. It's rare, like I mentioned before, and there's a higher incidence in children who are asthmatic and who are also obese. As far as preventing it, we'll look at the next slide, please. So basically the same things that we've been mentioning this whole time: good hygiene, washing your hands, cleaning surfaces frequently, wearing masks, and also social distancing. And just like COVID-19, to help prevent this multisystem inflammatory syndrome, it's important to make sure your children are eating healthy. Research has shown that as far as autoimmune disorders, which we're thinking this multisystem inflammatory syndrome is linked to, they do better when you have a diet that's high in plant-based foods, limiting processed foods, including sugar, refined flour, also exercising, getting your children out to exercise, getting fresh air, drinking lots of water, making sure their vitamin levels are high, vitamin D, zinc. You can get vitamin D from sunlight, and then also allowing them to have adequate rest and limiting the stress in their environment. All these things can help prevent maybe them getting this multisystem inflammatory syndrome that we're now seeing in children.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Woods. That is amazing. Now, I have a question. You mentioned autoimmune disease. It appears that it's similar to what's happening in the adult population with vasculitis. I'm going to, at this time, we don't want you to go away. We have some more questions for you, Dr. Woods. But I want to introduce again Dr. Steve Lee. Dr. Lee is a ear, nose, and throat specialist at Loma Linda. He's the vice chair of the department. He is also has his PhD in molecular biology. So Dr. Lee, we have some questions for you from an immunology perspective. What is autoimmune disease? You know, maybe for some of us, it's been a while since we had immunology and pathophysiology. Can you just give us a brief review of what is autoimmune disease? And clearly there seems to be some link with this multisystem inflammatory syndrome post-COVID sequelae.
Yes, absolutely. So autoimmune disease, basically, very simply said, is your immune system attacking yourself. So your immune system is like a defense, like a defense mechanism, and it's used to identify things that are not yourself and attack the things that are not yourself. And so what happens in development is the main part of your adaptive immune system are B cells and T cells, and they're formed in the bone marrow and the thymus. So the B cells in the bone marrow, the T cells in the thymus. And what they do is they have these receptors that can identify what we call antigens, or things that identify bits of microorganisms or bits of yourself. And if it recognizes yourself, those cells get deleted. And it's thought that about 98% of the cells that you develop as you're a child and growing up, that they get deleted because they attack yourself. So in the thymus or in the bone marrow, those cells get deleted. And then after they go out in the periphery, in the lymph nodes and the peripheral circulation, there's a second stage of deletion, where if they are found to have identification of yourself where they attack your own body, they get deleted, or they get sent to what's called regulatory T cell development pathway, where these are T cells that don't attack things, they suppress your immune system. So this is a mechanism by which you are protected from autoimmune disease. And autoimmune disease happens when this system does not work normally, and the cells attack yourself. And what will happen is that when you get a self-antigen, you obviously can't clear that from your body. If you have a virus or a bacteria, eventually your immune system will clear it, and then the B cells and T cells kind of, they stop growing and they stop being active and they become memory cells. But your self-antigen, you can't ever clear that because that's yourself. And that gives you this relentless stimulation and autoimmune disease that kind of runs away from you. So autoimmune diseases, there's a lot of them. And the more common ones are like rheumatoid arthritis, and lupus, and Sjogren's, Hashimoto's disease, Graves' disease, multiple sclerosis. There's over 100 autoimmune diseases. So this is a kind of a growing problem these days.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. You know, Pastor Mark, we want to ask you a question from an epidemiologic perspective. Over the last 100 years, you know, we started this discussion comparing our current COVID-19 crisis to the 1918 pandemic, the H1N1 pandemic. Over the last 100 years, interestingly enough, we've seen a spike in autoimmune disease. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, Dr. Leila. If you look at the United States currently, there's about 23.5 million people in the United States that have some type of autoimmune disease. According to the CDC, there's about 7% of the population has it. As Dr. Lee has mentioned, we're looking at things like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and things like celiac disease, type 1 diabetes. When you take a look at the causes of these diseases, I would list two major causes, although we are still studying these issues, but certainly genetics can play a significant factor in autoimmune disease. In addition to that, environment can play a factor. One of the things that I am interested in, because my wife and I have taught classes in physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional well-being, and that is what factors does lifestyle play in aggravating these diseases? And there are a number of lifestyle practices that can help to reduce the inflammation that take place as the result of these diseases. Dietary factors, stress will tend to aggravate these autoimmune diseases, as well as lack of exercise, sedentary diet, lack of rest. A plant-based diet seems to be a very added benefit to people who are on who are experiencing some of these autoimmune diseases, but we definitely see a major rise today.
Thank you so much, Pastor Mark. And you know, Dr. Woods, you mentioned a lot of those even as we're seeing in our pediatric population, correct? In your first presentation, is that correct, Dr. Woods?
Yes, that's correct.
So let's look at this a little deeper. Let's find out, you know, Dr. Woods and Pastor Mark, and actually Dr. Lee as well, we've talked a little bit about these lifestyle principles and the relationship to autoimmune disease, or might I say self-attack, as we're calling our Level Up program today. Dr. Lee, in order to understand COVID-19 just a little bit better, we have previously talked about the phases, if you will, of COVID-19. Can you just recap for us some of those phases or symptomatology process of COVID?
Yeah, so just like any viral disease, there is an incubation period where you're exposed to the virus and now you're infected with the virus, but you have no symptoms initially because your viral load and your body hasn't responded to it. And that incubation period can last from like 3 to 14 days based on the various studies that have been published over the past couple of months. And then what happens is you go through a phase of pretty mild symptoms where you have some fever, some cough. So nothing really serious, but just, you feel like you have the cold kind of. And then that can last for 3 to 7 days. Now, most people kind of stop at that phase. And then there's a small subset of people that go into a very severe phase. And this is where you have the shortness of breath, multisystem organ failure, disseminated clotting, cytokine storm, all those kinds of things. And I think this is actually a good place to kind of mention that there's a large number of asymptomatic infections. So there's a bunch of studies that have been published recently. So in China, they found out like 78% of the patients were asymptomatic, about 43%. Iceland did a very large survey where they tested a significant portion of their population. They found almost half of them were completely asymptomatic. Then in New York City, at New York Presbyterian, they were testing all the women that came in for delivery, mainly because they wanted to protect their own healthcare workers from being exposed. So they just tested every single woman that presented for delivery. And they found out that of the 215 women that came in during the surge, 33 of them were positive, so a little more than 10%. And of those 33, 88% of them were completely asymptomatic. So they were infected and they had the virus, but they were not symptomatic. So, and then if you look at the seroprevalence studies from Sweden, it shows that a lot of them are asymptomatic. So a more recent study wanted to find out, when are you most infectious? Is it the scenario 1 where you're most infectious at the time of symptoms onset? Is it scenario 2 where you're most infectious after your symptoms start? Or is it scenario 3 where you're most infectious before your symptoms start? And actually, it turns out that for COVID-19, it's scenario 3. You're most infectious before your symptoms start. So that's why it's a little bit hard to get a handle on this. We'll skip the slide. So basically, this is how it works. So for the vast majority of people that get COVID-19, so it's a large range because there's a lot of uncertainty about this right now, but 50 to 90% will have little to no symptoms. So they essentially never get past the incubation phase. And then about 10 to 40% will have mild symptoms and start. And there's just 1 to 2% of people that will have severe symptoms. And then a large proportion of that 1 to 2% will unfortunately end up succumbing to the disease.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you, Dr. Lee. I was actually very fascinated with that slide you showed as far as the before symptoms occur, as far as the infectivity is concerned. And of course, that elucidates, if you will, our prevention methods that we talked about last week, again, regarding quarantine. And as Pastor Mark has indicated, being careful for those around us and truly being our brother's keeper. Well, along those lines, I have a follow-up question for you, Dr. Woods. We're talking about the children, the pediatric population. We talked about the phases, if you will, of COVID-19. How do the symptoms for the children versus the adults fit into each one of these phases a little bit more specifically?
Right. So for adults versus, next slide, please. So for adults versus children, children are far more asymptomatic than the adults are. And so in the exposure period, just like Dr. Lee mentioned, you're usually asymptomatic. Adults may get the actual virus from their workplace, from various places in the community, and then they bring it home to the children. As daycares and schools are all closed, the children are getting the infection from a household exposure. As far as the mild symptoms, similar to adults, they have a slight fever. They can have cough, cold symptoms, things like that. The children initially are the ones that presented with some gastrointestinal symptoms, including vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain. They can also have some body aches and chills. And again, this is the low grade symptoms, the mild symptoms. And then just like adults, very few of them, less than 2% will go on to develop severe symptoms of respiratory failure, trouble breathing, pneumonia, for instance. And then an even less percentage of that will get this multisystem inflammatory syndrome that we're now seeing in children. So the takeaway is that the children are far less symptomatic, but they're the ones that are at higher risk for getting this multi-system inflammatory syndrome.
Now, Dr. Woods, I do have a follow-up question for you practically. And I'm speaking as a mommy, and I'm speaking for all the other mommies out there right now. When we see some of these symptoms in our children, for example, we see some desquamating skin on the hands or the feet, some of the other symptoms that you've described, what would be the best course of action that we should take right away, comparatively what we've seen in the past, you know, as far as making the results worse?
Right. So when you first notice the peeling of the hands, the fingertips usually, or the toes of your children, if you are noticing fever over 5 days, a lot of the kids are sleeping a lot. They're very tired. They have headaches. They have body aches. The first step to do would be taking them to their pediatrician so that they can have a look at them and see what's going on. Most pediatric offices can now test for the coronavirus. And so they're able to help them there. And if not, they will refer them to the emergency room. But the important thing is that before we were saying to kind of stay home, wait things out. But as I mentioned before, sometimes these kids are presenting to the pediatric office or to the ER very, very sick. So now we're kind of changing the advice that we're giving you and saying that go ahead and bring them in right away when you notice that something is going on with your child. Be your child's advocate.
Thank you, Dr. Woods. I just wanted to bring that point out to, again, make it practical to our mommies and our daddies and our grandparents. You know, if you see some of these symptoms in children, don't wait.
Right.
So, Dr. Lee, I want to come back to you. I'd like to come back to a review of immunology specifically, just very briefly. You touched on it before, but just recap real quick for us. Adaptive immunity versus innate immunity, and how specifically with the adaptive immunity or the later onset immunity, we're getting ARDS and multisystem organ failure, vasculitis in our adult population.
Yeah. So yeah, there's two parts of the immune system, and this is kind of a separation that we've made. They usually, you know, the innate system and the adaptive system work together all the time, but we've kind of made it easier for us as humans to kind of study and to look at. But the innate immunity system basically works on a pattern recognition system. It notices certain patterns are not us, and certain patterns are more like viruses and bacteria. And these are like neutrophils, macrophages, and these come in immediately, like within minutes to hours of infection. This will kick in and start trying to clear the virus. Now, if this is not successful, then we have a much stronger and more specific response, which is the adaptive immune system. And that works from those receptors that, remember, the B cells and the T cells had. Those receptors will identify the pathogen, and then they expand and become very active, and they'll start pumping out millions and millions of antibodies and T cells per hour, actually. And this will rapidly clear it. But during this time, there's a bunch of things called cytokines, which are chemicals that the immune system uses to talk to each other. They get ramped up in order to ramp up the production of these antibodies and these cells. And that is what can cause a lot of the damage that comes about in the severe phases of COVID-19.
And I believe that's what we're seeing as well. Thank you, Dr. Lee, with Dr. Woods, as we're talking about the pediatric population. Now, Dr. Woods, just very briefly, can you tell us the role of pharmaceuticals in the prevention and treatment of COVID-19, specifically self-attack and across the board for autoimmune disease, please?
Right. So with COVID-19, there's no golden cure. There's no medicine out there that's going to get rid of it right away. But if you want to go to the next slide, please. We advocate supportive care in the hospital and both at home. And then there's a couple medications that we do want to use with caution. So for children and adults who are infected with COVID-19 or having symptoms, it's been recommended to not use NSAIDs. Now, NSAIDs are things like ibuprofen, Aleve, naproxen. You're going to want to do other things like Tylenol to control fever, to control body aches. There's been minimal evidence showing that it can cause prolonged disease or severe disease. Another medication is methotrexate. This medicine is used with patients who have rheumatoid arthritis. It has been known to suppress the immune system, but we do recommend that if you are one of those patients that has rheumatoid arthritis, to continue taking it and not to stop taking it. And then another medication that's been associated with COVID-19 are steroids. Incidentally, for adults, it has been shown to maybe cause increased risk of severe disease because steroids do suppress your immune system. However, for children who are getting this multisystem inflammatory syndrome, steroids is one of the treatments for it because steroids can also, if it's an autoimmune response, such as we're suspecting this multisystem inflammatory syndrome is, then steroids will help lower your immune system and lower your body attacking itself. And so that's where we see medications play a role right now in COVID-19 and the multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children.
Thank you, Dr. Woods. And I just want to point something out. You know, really important point is that COVID-19 is a novel, a new coronavirus. We don't have the perfect medication. We don't have the perfect vaccine. In fact, we have lots of studies that are going on right now, but we just don't have the answers because there just aren't any answers yet because it's evolving. Our information, I should say, is evolving. Yes, the virus is evolving, but our understanding of the virus is evolving. And I think that's a really important point because just a little while ago, actually 6 weeks ago, we talked about trying to avoid the utilization of steroids, particularly in the innate immune time, because we would like to increase the opportunity of the immune system to fight off the virus. And now there's actually studies going on that are looking at early utilization of steroids. So the fact of the matter is, we just don't know. We just don't know. And with that, Pastor Mark, I'm coming back to you. In this situation, you know, where we don't have an answer, we wish we did, but we don't. Looking again at history, looking back through time, historically, starting with the 1918 pandemic, some of these principles, these novel principles that were used by Seventh-day Adventist institutions or sanitariums, and then even going before that to some of our Hebrew Jewish situations, even we talked about the bubonic plague. Can you tell us from history, are there some lessons that we can learn as far as the treatment of not just COVID, but even perhaps autoimmune disease?
Well, let's go back, Layla, and talk a little bit about 1918 and the pandemic there that killed so many million people. There was one institution where 90 of 120 people were infected. None of them died, and they all had mild symptoms, where in the community around them, there were multiple deaths. It was a small Seventh-day Adventist seminary in Hutchinson, Minnesota. Now, the county health officer was a man by the name of Dr. Frank Shepard. And Dr. Shepard took a look at what was going on at that health institution, and he was absolutely amazed. He said that they have no deaths, and he began to analyze what was happening at that institution. One of the first things that happened is that when a person got a sore throat or a mild fever, they were isolated or they were quarantined. Secondly, they used hydrothermal therapy on them. And, you know, we're experimenting with that. There's some protocols. Dr. Eric Nelson and about 20 other physicians at one of the hospitals in Chattanooga is using hydrothermal therapy on some COVID-19 patients. But they did this in what was called a sanitarium. A sanitarium was a place of health and healing at that period of time. There were 40 or 50 of these kind of Seventh-day Adventist sanitariums. They had very excellent results with people who had the Spanish flu, and they had much, much lower death rates than the average hospital and the best hospitals in the United States. They basically took about 5 strategies. 1, quarantine. 2, hydrothermal therapy. 3, rest. When the patient was noted, they put him on rest. Fourthly, water, drinking large amounts of water. And then fifthly, they put them on a very nutritious plant-based diet that had significantly reduced amounts of fat and of cholesterol producing foods and sugar. So they looked at this as a total approach that could build the immune system. And of course, being a Christian institution, they spent time praying for these patients. Their difference in disease rate was remarkable. We have found that throughout history. If you look at a historical approach to pandemics, and you take this approach of quarantine on the one hand, building the immune system on the other by using various natural therapies and modalities, that seems to make a significant difference.
Wow, Pastor Mark, that's phenomenal. It's amazing what we can learn from history, just looking to the past to understand the current situation. You know, I have another question. In this situation, particularly as we look even at not necessarily 1918 pandemic, but you talked about the previous pandemics, how did they understand immunity and proper nutrition even before, I dare say, germ theory and Louis Pasteur existed?
Well, looking at it through the eyes of a theologian now, in the book of Genesis in the Bible, when God created human beings, he created them in his image. God's desire was that human beings live healthy and whole and happy lives. His great desire was that they live not for 70 years or 80 years and then die. We live in a broken world. It's a sinful world. But if we get back to the Eden life, and if you look at Eden, you find there in Genesis chapter 1 that God gave them a plant-based diet, and that they understood that that plant-based diet was the very best diet for humanity. It was not until the days of the flood that God gave humanity the opportunity to eat meat, and then he only asked them to eat the clean meats. But if you go back to the original diet, go back to the Eden life, what do you have in Eden life? You have this good, healthy vegetarian diet. Now, I was looking at some studies on autoimmune and a plant-based diet. Let me share just two of those studies with you that I think are really fascinating. There was a study that was published in the Journal of American Rheumatology. It was published in 2001. And the authors researched the pain levels of those with rheumatoid arthritis and a plant-based diet and found they had significant less pain. In 2008, the Journal of Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics said that a plant-based vegetable diet will build a healthy immune response. In 2012, another article came out in Nature magazine saying that saturated fat breaks down healthy bacteria in the gut and causes inflammation. So when you go back and take a look at what's taking place in cutting-edge research today in the autoimmune system and how to help reduce the pain of these diseases and the inflammation, there's really some interesting tie-ins that we may get some real help with if we went back to that very balanced, wholesome, nutritious, plant-based diet that came from the Garden of Eden.
Thank you, Pastor Mark. That's fascinating. Now, Dr. Lee, we've heard a lot, from Pastor Mark, both theologically from Garden of Eden and even supporting evidence. I have a question for you specifically regarding the scientific role of nutrition and meat-based foods directly linked with autoimmune. Have you found anything recently as far as that?
Yeah, so there was actually a very recent paper published looking at what they wanted to be as an anti-inflammatory diet for rheumatoid arthritis, which is one of the most common autoimmune diseases. And this probably would be relatable to many different autoimmune diseases. But basically what they did is they scoured the literature and they found all the studies that talked about diet and inflammatory. So these are kind of the things that they mentioned. And one is increased omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. Those are like ALA from flaxseed, or DHA and EPA from marine algae or fish. And then increased intake of monounsaturated fatty acids. Those are usually found in nuts. Then decrease intake of trans fats and saturated fats. Those are dairy products and meat, basically, and processed oils. And then high intake of prebiotics. And that is basically, we found out recently that your microbiome in the gut is extremely important for inflammation and immune structure. And what feeds a healthy microbiome are basically fiber. So fiber is only found in plants. Then daily intake of probiotics, that's what they recommended. That would be like kimchi, sauerkraut, kefir, those kinds of things. And then reduce large proteins in the gut. Condiments with anti-inflammatory spices, that's turmeric, ginger, that kind, garlic, those kinds of things. Eliminate salt. Decrease choline precursors of trimethylamine N oxides. Those are mainly found in meats, and then in your gut, they're converted over to this TMAO, and those are pro-inflammatory. And avoid sugars, sugary foods and beverages, and also processed carbohydrates. And then increase the intake of antioxidants. These are basically phytochemicals. And phytochemical is just a word that means chemicals from plants. And so those are obviously only found in plants. And so a lot of it, there was another recent paper that talked about basically you can have something that you're exposed to in an environment that looks a lot like us. And since essentially meat is flesh and we're made of flesh, meat has a lot of crosstalk possibility. And there is this chemical called sialic acid that's found in red meat that could set up a cross reaction where we see that as a foreign antigen, but it looks very similar to one of our own antigens, and you can have autoimmune disease start that way as well.
Fascinating, fascinating. I think that's a really amazing, what you listed here is profound. And the sialic acid study, I know that there was one that came out in 2016 and an original one that I saw in 2002. And there seems to be a relationship of chronic inflammation and cancer. I know you're an ENT cancer specialist. Have you found that to be the case?
Yeah, so it's pretty well known that meat drives cancer, and recently most of the public health organizations have listed processed meat definitely as a carcinogen, and that's because the evidence in that is just overwhelming. But there's a lot of evidence to say that almost all meats are in some ways carcinogenic, mainly because of several things. One, cooking meat. If you cook meat at all, and almost everyone cooks meat before they eat it, it forms what's called heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These are known carcinogens. So these are things that we give to rats and lab animals to cause cancer so that we can study cancer in them. And then these TMIOs, like we talked about last time, that are formed when you eat meat, and then your gut microbacteria change them into these things that cause cancer. And chronic inflammation is a well-known pathway to carcinogenesis. So smoking and drinking and the cancers that I deal with, that's basically a chronic inflammatory state. And so, yeah, and lastly, heme iron. So heme iron is in the blood, and heme iron is known to promote inflammation and carcinogenesis.
And I think that heme iron is fascinating. You know, Pastor Mark, you were talking about some of the Levitical principles. And I know, correct me if I'm wrong, please explain to us a little further, but the Hebrews were instructed specifically regarding blood, or heme, if you will, of how they were, as you said, after the flood, to handle meat products that were considered clean. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that might relate to decreased or differences in colon cancer in different people groups that follow some of these principles?
Sure. Back in the Old Testament, now there are many people that have the idea that the Old Testament health principles were simply given to the Jewish nation. But when you look at those health principles of the Old Testament, they're not simply legalistic requirements. They are given to us by a loving God who cares. And one of the passages in the Old Testament, the book of Leviticus, says, "Thou shalt not eat the fat or the blood." Well, we know today, for example, that a high-fat diet predisposes us to both coronary artery disease, stroke, and also to various types of cancers Dr. Lee has mentioned. But thou shalt not eat the blood, the Bible says. Why not? Because of the fact that the life of the flesh is in the blood. So there can be disease pathogens, there can be the emphasis of this heme. And if you look at, I was looking at a study done in Jerusalem, and it was very fascinating to me. If you look at secular Jews who do not follow the basic Levitical health principles, they're living in Jerusalem. Then you take rather Orthodox Jews who are living in the same city but follow these health principles. The heart disease rates, the cancer rates are far higher among secular Jews than they are among more religious Jews.
Wow.
Which and it's an interesting, because they both have the same genetic backgrounds,
right,
have the same environmental backgrounds, but they are radically different. if you look at population groups around the world that have adequate exercise, drink adequate amounts of pure water, get adequate amounts of rest, and have they lean toward anyway, they have more plant-based diet, they are going to be far more healthy than those that do not.
Fascinating, Dr. Finley. And you know what's amazing too is that I dare say there's some research to indicate that cardiovascular disease and of course cancer, as we've already heard from Dr. Lee, are inflammatory relationships. In other words, there's an autoimmune component there. So what an amazing principle that God, and it shouldn't be such a surprise, but that God who knew our bodies gave us a perfect prescription, a real perfect prescription, if you will. Now, Pastor Mark, you and your wife, Teeny, have been studying the relationship of science and biblical principles for many years. I myself have come to your classes and learned quite a bit. Now, you've also gone into specific foods. We've heard some of those from Dr. Woods and Dr. Lee. What kind of experience have you and your wife in your natural lifestyle cooking schools helped patients specifically with inflammatory self-attack or autoimmune disease?
Well, Layla, we enjoy conducting courses in wellness, in natural lifestyle cooking. There have been just thousands and thousands of people who have attended. And our goal in those natural lifestyle cooking classes is to make healthy food look good, taste good, and of course, be good for us. Mm-hmm. We have seen people lose weight. They have people who have bordered on overweight or obesity have come. They have lost the significant amounts of weight on a plant-based diet. They have reduced their harmful cholesterol significantly, their LDL. They have reduced blood pressure. Many of them have been inspired to get on a better exercise program. And so it's just a joy to see people understand holistic health. That when God created us, he didn't create us to be sick. Now, a lot of sickness may come from environmental factors, genetic factors, but there are certain lifestyle decisions that we can make that help reduce the risk of disease and enable us to have that healthy, abundant life that Christ wants.
I appreciate that tremendously, Pastor Mark. And you know, on your screen right now, viewers, Pastor Mark and his wife, Teeny, have a wonderful class. Again, it's called Natural Lifestyle Cooking School, and you can actually attend that online. It's hopelives365biblestudy.com/health. Again, please try to view the wonderful program that they have there at their facility. Now, Dr. Woods, I want to come back to you. And specifically, we talked about pediatric population. That's where we began this discussion. We started with prevention, looking at nutrition. Dr. Woods, can you tell us a little bit about the opposite and processed foods specifically in regard to pediatric autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes, asthma, allergy, and perhaps could we postulate a potential relationship with COVID-19 MIS?
Yes, we absolutely can. And so I also want to point out regarding autoimmune diseases that there is a genetic component as well. But I just listed a few of the autoimmune diseases that are found in our patients: type 1 diabetes, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, lupus, celiac, etc. So there's an actual autoimmune diet. I know we've all kind of touched on it specifically, but it consists of fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, no added sugar, no refined oil. So that's just going to be avocado oil, olive or coconut oil. Those are natural oils. And so those foods help us fight back when our body is attacking itself. They help decrease inflammation in the body. They help build up the immune system, and they help make us stronger. So some of the things we found in the pediatric population is that dairy causes inflammation in the body. There's many research studies that have shown that a high dairy consumption is linked to an increased incidence of type 1 diabetes. And for other diseases such as allergies and asthma that do have an immune component, we find that when you limit dairy in these patients that have asthma and have allergies, that their symptoms go down. And sometimes they can get rid of their allergies and their asthma when they limit their dairy and their intake of refined foods, including high sugar in their diets.
Thank you so much, Dr. Woods. I appreciate that. Dr. Lee, we've heard about this multisystem inflammatory syndrome. Last week, you showed us scientifically there's a high probability that we will encounter a second wave in the fall. And of course, learning from history, the 1918 pandemic did demonstrate that as well. So as we're thinking about our children, again, as mommies, as doctors, as grandmas, as grandpas, and we're looking at their education, something very similar just recently happened in Syria and France as they restarted schools after closing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there were several clusters of, you can turn that slide off. There are several clusters of new infections. When we send kids back to school, they're going to be around other kids and playing, and kids are not going to be social distancing when they're in school, especially the younger kids. They're just not going to understand that they can't hug their friend. So
Right.
it's very likely that we're going to get clusters of infections in kids, and luckily kids overall do very well. And MISC is a serious disease, but is pretty treatable. But yeah, Syria and France saw outbreaks, and Sweden has been seeing outbreaks as they've gone through their pandemic. And in Korea, when they're doing their schools, they've started schools as well. They put plexiglass enclosures around every student at lunchtime so they can see each other and talk, but they're kind of walled off from each other. So there are some challenges. And we're going to have to, I think our public health officials are looking at these outbreaks and trying to, balance the children's education and social development with their health. And I think things will change as the data comes out.
Absolutely. Understanding prevention, I think, again, illustrates the importance of what we're talking about today as we embark on improving, optimizing the immunity of our children right now before we're looking at the fall coming about. Pastor Mark, it leads me to another discussion, whether that be about schools, whether that be about how we're going to approach this whole COVID-19 crisis. Some have said we're going to plug forward, we're going to do anything, and all we need is just more faith. We just need more faith, and God will protect us. God will take care of us. How do we balance faith and presumption? How do we be a wise steward of what God has given us? How do we do that from a theological perspective?
I think, Dr. Leila, again, if you go back to history, it helps us. Ancient Israel helps us. In ancient Israel, the religious leaders could have said, all we need to do is have faith and allow the leper to remain in the camp. But yet there were specific instructions that leper was to be taken out of the camp. What is faith? Faith is trusting God. Faith is the ability to know that my life is in God's hands. But faith does not in any way keep us from using our brains. We don't check our brains at the door when we become a Christian or when we become a person of faith, whether that's Jewish or Muslim or any other faith. So when you look at a situation like COVID-19, you ask a number of questions. You say to yourself, what is best in this given situation based on the data and science for the larger community? Because faith and science are not necessarily two different things. If you believe that God is all-knowing, if you believe that God is the greatest mind in the universe, then God has given scientists minds to work for the curing of disease and the curtailing of that disease. The Hippocratic Oath says, do no harm.
Yeah.
So that is based on love your neighbor as yourself, do no harm. So how do you balance faith and presumption? You weigh the data and the scientific information that comes across, and you make the best possible decision, and you ask God for wisdom to make that decision. But you also believe that in spite of living the best possible life we can live, we are in a broken world. We may get sick. You may try the best preventive methods in the world, but you still may get sick. But your life is in God's hands. So you do everything you can to prevent, but you say, God, you are sovereign. You are over all. My life is in your hands.
That's a very, very, very profound and deep answer. And the truth of the matter is we do live in a desperate, sinful world, and we're not going to live forever, until Jesus comes back. So I think understanding that principle is very vital. Along those lines of living longer, Dr. Lee, Seventh-day Adventists have been purporting a plant-based diet, like we talked about, for about 160 years. Adventist Health Study 1 and 2 showed some very interesting results as far as longevity is concerned, and specifically in regard to diseases. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us just a little bit about that as far as cancer and autoimmune disease are concerned?
Yeah, so the Adventist Health Study is actually a really amazing study of about 100,000 people that have been followed for over 2 decades. So, in these studies, when you study diet, you can't really randomize people to a diet. They're going to choose whatever diet they're going to eat.
Right.
And the Adventist group is very diverse, and we have similar lifestyles, other than there is a pretty wide range of dietary patterns in the Adventist church. About 50% are meat eaters, and then about 10 to 20% are vegetarian, vegan, pescatarian, or very semi-meat eaters. So basically, you have a group of people that are willing to be followed for decades, that have different dietary patterns, but also don't smoke and don't drink. So those are confounding factors in any kind of long study. And so it's a great study population, and the NIH has been funding this for many years. And there's been very consistent results in the Adventist Health Study that show that a vegan diet and a vegetarian diet is healthier in terms of many diseases, cardiovascular disease, cancer, as compared to the meat-eating disease. So these are large studies of over 100,000 people. So these are some of the best longitudinal studies that are available for lifestyle and diet patterns.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Now, a follow-up to that question, Dr. Finley, is specifically in regard to whether maybe perhaps we might be thinking, well, this was just funded by a bunch of Christians purporting their understanding of diet and nutrition based on biblical principles. Was there anything done recently by a secular organization, specifically the Blue Zone analysis, and what did that show?
Well, the Blue Zones are specific geographical locations in the world where people tend to live longer. Many of these people were living to 90, 95, 100 years old. And you begin to look at these blue zones. Now, the reason they're called blue zones is because when the researchers were studying them with Dan Buettner and his team, when they saw an area that appeared to have a large number of centenarians, people living 100 or over, they circled it in blue with a blue pen. And then they said, hey, these are the blue zones. They found the blue zone in Okinawa, Japan, found another one in Nicosia, Costa Rica. They found another. So they found these basic blue zones. This is what they found out about them, that they largely had great family relationships, good personal relationships. They got adequate amounts of exercise. They had less stress. They leaned toward a plant-based diet. Now, they weren't all totally plant-based, but that was the direction of their diet. And when they came to the United States and they looked at Loma Linda, California, they simply saw that there at Loma Linda, that was largely a population of Seventh-day Adventists. Now, this was not Seventh-day Adventists who were doing this study, but here were people living in California that were living longer than native Californians around them, some 10 years longer. Wow. So these basic principles that we've been talking about diet and exercise and water, and those basic principles of rest and faith in God, they translate into better health and greater longevity.
Yeah, fascinating, Pastor Finley, fascinating. It brings me to another final question. As we're wrapping this up, how do we find hope in our current situation? We don't have that perfect pill, that perfect, if you will, vaccine right now, but we do have some wonderful principles, I dare say, God gave us in the Garden of Eden of nutrition. Mm-hmm. How can we take these principles of nutrition and provide us hope specifically, instead of allowing ourselves to have anxiety or depression and self-attack our emotional, mental, and I dare say spiritual health? How can we prevent self-attack of our emotional and spiritual health using these hopeful and helpful principles?
You know, Jesus made an interesting statement. He said, man shall not live, or women shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. And so God has given to us eternal principles of his love, his grace, his kindness. One of the things that brings us peace is understanding that we're not simply a genetic anomaly. We're not simply cosmic accidents. We're not simply skin covering bones. We're created in the image of God. And if you understand the fact that you're created in the image of God and that God cares for you, that makes all the difference. In sickness and in health, God cares. In joy and in sorrow, God cares. In life and in death, God cares. And this idea of the care of God for us helps us to be free from the crippling worry and the paralyzing anxiety that grips so many people.
Thank you, Pastor Mark. Do you have any closing remarks for us and a closing prayer for us as well?
Sure. You know, we do live in a broken world, but we can have the confidence that God is there in the midst of that brokenness, in the midst of sickness and suffering, and that as we follow his principles, we can live an abundant life. The abundant life is much more than physical health. The abundant life is mental peace, inner joy, satisfaction, and contentment in a broken world. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, we want to thank you with all of our hearts for the fact that there are eternal principles verified by science, confirmed by the scientific data and research. These principles found in Scripture are given there to us to help us live that abundant life, enable us to understand them more fully, but most of all, to know that there's a God that loves us and cares for us, and that he'll never leave us or forsake us. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, viewers, for joining us. Again, we want to invite you to some very exciting upcoming events. Number one, join us on AWR360 Health, our Facebook group. Please join the Facebook group. We will be sending you notices throughout the week. We look forward to you actually being able to correspond with each of us. The next thing I want to invite you to is a very special upcoming program about spiritual healing. It's actually starting next Sunday. So for the next 2 Sundays, we're going to have a spiritual healing opportunity. And that is found at awr.org/Bible. So 7 p.m. in your local time, you can join Cami Utman and learn amazing additional biblical principles. So the next time we will meet is not until the 7th of June. But in the meantime, join the Facebook group and we will continue to give you wonderful updates and converse with you. Finally, I want to excite you with the next topic for our upcoming Level Up program. We're going to be looking closer at Eden, and specifically Eden, living the extraordinary life. We're going to be looking at principles of water, both internally and externally with hydrothermal therapy, and rest. Again, we look forward to you joining us then. At this time, we're going to take some questions. I believe we have some questions. Here's our first one. The first one comes to us from Grace. Do people with autoimmune disease have a higher risk of getting COVID-19? And if they're infected, is it a more severe case? Dr. Lee, we're going to ask you that question.
I'm not aware of any data on that, because I don't think we've had systematically looked at whether there's a higher prevalence. There's 2 theories about that. One is that the people with the autoimmune disease will have a higher risk and have more severe symptoms because their immune system is not working well, because their immune system is focused on attacking itself. Another theory is that they may actually do better because their immune systems tend to be revved up. And that's the problem with people with autoimmune problems, is that they don't have the brakes in their immune system, so their immune system is revved up. So there's possibility that they may do better, and there's no data one way or the other that I'm aware of. But there's like 20,000 papers published on COVID, and I haven't looked at all 20,000 of them.
Not yet, anyway. Dr. Woods, have you seen anything in the pediatric population to indicate one way or the other at this point?
Not really, because most pediatric patients are asymptomatic, and so I think the best thing to approach the best way to approach it right now is to focus on prevention. The things that we talked about, the diet that God gave us in Eden, that plant-based diet, water, exercise, sunshine, those sorts of things. That's the best way to approach it right now, is prevention.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, what about homeopathic remedies? There's lots of ideas what exactly that terminology means. We've talked about, I guess you could even say principles of nutrition might be homeopathic remedies. Dr. Woods, do you have anything for us as far as that's concerned?
All right, so I'm going to piggyback off what Dr. Lee says. So there aren't any studies right now, and that's because coronavirus, COVID-19 is so novel, it's so new. So we don't have a lot of studies to say how homeopathic remedies can affect it, but we do have historical evidence as far as how hydrotherapy helps to affect disease processes. It helps to slow it down and often stop it. We know the effects of nutrition on autoimmune diseases. And so we can assume that some of those homeopathic remedies that we've talked about, nutritious diet, hydrotherapy, sunlight, all those sorts of things should have a positive effect on reducing your symptoms of COVID-19 and maybe even preventing you from getting a symptomatic or severe case of COVID-19.
Thank you, Dr. Woods. And I just want to make a clarification. I apologize. It's not June 14 that we'll be reconvening. It's June 7. It's not June 7, it's June 14 again. So June 14 will be our first presentation, a follow-up on Level Up. Okay, next question. According to the chart by Dr. Lee, so how exactly does it work? Are you in the clear after 3 to 14 days, and then 3 to 7, and then 4 to 14 or 4 to 12 days, symptoms reappear? Dr. Lee, can you make a little clarification in this regards?
Yeah, so that for the asymptomatic people, since they're asymptomatic and they don't come in for medical care, we don't actually know what their period of viral infectivity is. There's some study, a new study right now that shows that about 11 days after symptoms appear, most people's viral load is gone if they've stopped having symptoms. But it's unclear how long people are, and it's because everyone has a different immune response. The speed of viral clearance from each person will be different. So that's why there's such a large range, 3 to 14 days. So some people will get exposed and within 3 days, they'll start having symptoms. Other people, they'll be exposed and maybe the virus will be slowly going through their system and they won't have symptoms for 2 weeks later. So it is a very wide range. And the only way to know is to get tested at the end and see if you're still shedding virus to know are you safe to go back out into society.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Lee. We have a question for Dr. Woods. Dr. Woods mentioned wearing a mask. However, do we decipher the fact from fiction with regards to mask wearing? What is the benefit of mask wearing, Dr. Woods?
Okay, so it's recommended, and this is a CDC recommendation, to wear a mask when you're out in public. Of course, if you're at home, you don't need to wear a mask, but it serves two purposes when you wear a mask in public. One, it decreases the spread of you spreading the disease, in that if you have COVID-19, wearing a mask will help trap some of those larger respiratory droplets and prevent you from spreading the disease to anybody else. And then as far as preventing you from getting the disease, there's no studies to really show that it does do that, but the main thing is to prevent you from spreading the disease to other people. Social distancing will work better.
Right.
Layla, could I comment on that? Because
yes, please,
I think this is something that, is talked about a lot. It's there's people going back and forth on the whole mask wearing thing. And so there is actually some pretty good information. There were 2 studies published well before COVID-19. They were looking at flu actually, and they found people that had the flu, and they had some people not wear masks, and they had some people wear masks, like they would wear the mask and their family, their household members would wear the mask. And these were randomized controlled studies. And they showed that mask wearing, if everyone's wearing it in terms of the flu, and we suspect that because flu is a virus and this is a virus, they would spread similarly, that it's a 70 to 80% decrease in transmission rate with mask wearing. So it's pretty significant. And people are like, well, the cloth masks, the viruses can go right through them. That's true. It's not 100% effective. But like Dr. Wood said, the big droplets don't go through. And this is why when we do surgery, we wear masks, because we don't want droplets going on the patient. And there's no real risk of getting like less oxygen or anything, because the mask traps a very small volume of air, and you're going to filter all that out. And if it caused hypoxia, you wouldn't want surgeons operating on you for 8 hours while they're not getting enough oxygen to their brain. That would not work out well for anyone.
Very good point. Thank you, Dr. Lee. Pastor Mark, do you have any comments in regard to that topic as well?
The only comment that I have is this: from the Christian ethic, we believe that every human being is precious, and if my transmission of that disease, of those droplets, would infect another person, that's contrary to the Christian ethic. So the Christian ethic is one of love, in which we desire health for others. So even if the mask is a little bit uncomfortable for me, loving my neighbor as myself, if I can protect. And the problem is that I think Dr. Lee mentioned that, what is it, Doctor? 35% of the cases are asymptomatic or in that area.
Yeah, like way more than that, probably.
Okay, so
you don't know if you have it.
Yeah, that's right. So let's assume that that's the case, that I don't know that I have it. Therefore, it's an act of kindness and love for others for me to wear the mask. Absolutely. Because I don't know if I'm transmitting it.
Absolutely.
Very good point. And Pastor Mark, another question for you. We learned a lot of amazing principles about nutrition, both scientifically and biblically. How can we get our family members more excited about eating a plant-based diet?
I'll tell you how not to get them excited. You will not get them excited if you throw all the meat out of your freezer and tell them you're never going to eat meat again and you're never going to take them to a hamburger joint again. That's the way you won't get them excited. You'll get them angry. This is how you get them excited. You taste the taste of your family. Find one plant-based dish that they really love, one vegetarian dish. Experiment with a few. Don't use force or pressure. Don't use lecturing. But your children's appetites will adjust to a plant-based diet if you gradually give it to them. So provide for them, for example, abundant fruits, strawberries, blueberries. You say, well, those are a little more expensive. Well, medication is quite expensive too. And it is less expensive to eat healthfully. So find some berries that they like, find a vegetable that they like, and find a nice plant-based dish recipe. My wife has a wonderful vegetarian cookbook called Natural Lifestyle Cooking. And if you get onto our website at Hope Lives 365, you can find that. But I would say gradually incorporate these principles into your family's diet, make it a very positive experience, a joyful experience, and find things they like and gradually work with them.
Great. Thank you, Pastor Mark. You know, Dr. Woods, you're a mommy, as I am. And as a parent, what should we be looking for with this Kawasaki-Like syndrome or multisystem inflammatory syndrome?
Right. And if I can just add to what Pastor
Absolutely.
Billy just mentioned, one thing, and we tell our patients this all the time, our parents who are trying to get their kids to eat vegetables, we say, get them involved in cooking. Let them go shopping with you and pick out some vegetables that they do like and experiment together in the kitchen. If a child wants to make a dish, they're far more likely to eat that dish because they're excited about eating their work, what they just made. So I just wanted to add to what Pastor Finley just mentioned.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So what should we be looking for with this Kawasaki-like disease?
Right, so that's an excellent question. So it does have a large array of symptoms, but specifically look for fevers. We're finding kids are having fevers and sometimes no other symptoms, but fever for 5 to 10 days. That could be a sign of it. This Kawasaki-like disease, this multisystem inflammatory syndrome, causes peeling of your fingers, your fingertips mostly, and your toes, the tips of your toes. It can cause red, swollen eyes, kind of mimicking a really bad pink eye, conjunctivitis. Sometimes the kids are very tired. They just want to sleep all the time. And we all know that's not normal for any child, unless for a teenager, to sleep all the time. They can have body aches. They just don't feel good. For younger kids, they could be a little bit more fussy. The good thing is we're not really seeing this in babies. It's usually kids over 1 to the age of 21. So those are some of the things that you want to look for. Vomiting, diarrhea, we see those as well. The important take home is don't delay seeking medical help. call your doctor right away if your child is exhibiting any of these symptoms.
Great. Well, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. Thank you, Pastor Mark, for helping us to keep a well-rounded spiritual approach, and Doctors Wood, Dr. Lee, thank you for making sure that we stay accountable to the science as well. And again, most importantly, holistically, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. To our viewers, we want to say a very special thank you for joining us. Again, we are excited about continuing to investigate further questions as we follow in this level up process. Again, I just want to make it very clear, May 31st and June 7th are the next two Sundays. We're looking forward to joining in a wonderful presentation on spiritual healing, and then we will reconvene with Level Up on June 14, entitled Eden, Living the Extraordinary Life. Until then, join the Facebook group at awr.org/health, and we look forward, again, for all of us to continue to grow physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Until then, stay healthy, happy, and we look forward to seeing you soon. God bless.